So I wanted to begin with a sort of strange story. Walker Percy, in one of his novels, The Last Gentleman, at least I think this is where this happens in one of Walker Percy's novels. A young woman brings a young Catholic woman brings her Protestant boyfriend home to meet her family. And one of her sisters is a religious nun. And this young Protestant fellow from Princeton had never met a nun before. And he's sitting there awkwardly on the couch, and he says that his whole body went limp because he didn't really know what to do with himself in the presence of a nun, whether he was supposed to bow or kiss her ring or something. And he sat there just staring at her wrist. You know this, Alex. He sat there staring at her wrist and wondering whether if you cut into her wrist, there would be bones and muscles and tendons and veins, or whether she would just be solid nun substance all the way through. And I think that reading Russell Kirk's Roots of the American Order is an antidote to the idea that if you cut through an American, you will find solid liberal substance all the way through. I think that Russell Kirk's Roots of the American Order makes the argument that you would find Aristotelian bones, Ciceronian muscles, even some Thomistic tendons, and certainly some Jeremiah running through her veins. And so I think that Russell Kirk is primarily an antidote, right, to the work of Louis Hart's The Liberal Tradition in America, published in 1952, which argues that both to the left and to the right, conservatives and liberals, progressives, are liberals, and nothing but liberals in the American tradition. Whereas Russell Kirk argues that there is such a thing as an Anglo-American conservative mind. So, Kirk's argument is, in essence, the American Revolution is not like the French Revolution. This is Russell Kirk's thesis writ large in his 1974 classic, The Roots of the American Order, the text that will guide our discussions for the next week. The American Revolution is not like the French Revolution. If you take the French Revolution as the primary analog for the American Revolution, if you lump the American Revolution with the French, the Latin American, and later European revolutions in a single event we call the Age of Revolutions, if you insist with Marx that all political revolutions of the 17th and 18th century were mere preludes to the ultimate culmination in the true social revolution in the 19th or 20th centuries, you will misunderstand the spirit of 76. This is Russell Kirk's thesis writ large in his 1974 classic. You may have started reading at the beginning of this text and have read his chapter on order, and then have started into the 5 cities, Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, classical Rome, Christian Rome, and then London for 6 chapters before you get to Philadelphia. But Russell Kirk makes it clear that the reason why he's giving this kind of a history for America is because of how he reads the American Revolution. And so you have to look at the section entitled Declaration of Independence and Constitution, the small section entitled A Revolution Not Made But Prevented, to get Russell Kirk's raison d'etre for doing the entire history this way. Aristotle tells us in his Rhetoric that analogy is the most powerful tool in the rhetorician's toolbox. To say that something is like something else locks the mind into a comparison. We can make fictional analogies. I think everyone's favorite fictional analogy at the moment is hobbits fighting against Mordor, and that this is an analogy for World War II. You can make historical analogies, such as arguing that the end of the Cold War was like the end of, what should we pick? World War I, which was not followed, where defeat was not followed by military occupation, and instead we have the rise again of the same power. But the art of making analogies is always a powerful, persuasive weapon. In America, you have progressives who will hail the American Revolution as like the French Revolution. Making this comparison, they argue that the American Revolution was not quite revolutionary enough, an unfinished revolution, they call it, implying that we need to move on from the revolution of the bourgeoisie to the revolution of the proletariat. They don't like the property owners who were gentlemen constitution writers, and they prefer the mob. But in America, you also have some conservatives who excoriate the American Revolution as like the French Revolution, tainted by an enthusiasm for secularizing and rationalizing all sacred social bonds out of existence with utilitarian calculations of individual self-interest. Against both of these groups, Russell Kirk's book, The Roots of the American Order, stands athwart the comparison, vehemently and voluminously arguing for continuity rather than rupture in the American founding, arguing for an American founding that is fundamentally conservative rather than revolutionary. Kirk's book comes as a surprise to most readers. I have taught this book both in my American Civilization class on the Dallas campus of the University of Dallas in Texas, the land of the free, where I teach American civilization. And I have also taught this book on the University of Dallas's rather spectacular Rome campus, where I teach Western civilization in the summer. I was just in Rome and Athens. I was supposed to go to Israel next week, but that trip has been unfortunately canceled. So I was trying to include Israel in my bailiwick of 5 cities, but I haven't managed to get there yet. But I have taught this book over and over, and of course it always comes as a surprise to people that the history of the American founding that Kirk gives us starts with Moses on Mount Sinai. Isn't this starting a little far back, right? A bit of a shock, right? And that we're going to slowly get towards the Americans through Pericles' funeral oration, and Cicero's defense of the Roman Republic, and the founding of the medieval universities, not to mention the Crusades. Let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. Is this really where we should be beginning an American civilization class, right? With Moses at Mount Sinai. Does Kirk make his case, right, that this is where we should begin? Doesn't American history begin with the modern era? In the bright light of modernity, with 1492, Columbus sailing the ocean blue, or 1517, Martin Luther beginning the Protestant Reformation. Where is the proper beginning for the story of American civilization? In my end is my beginning. Where and how Kirk chooses to begin the story is very much determined by how he characterizes the end, or the telos of the American founding. Christopher Dawson, in his classic book, The Crisis of Western Education, makes 1789, the French Revolution, the turning point of his history of education. He says this: the 22 universities of France, that's a lot of universities in one state, France being the size of Texas. The 22 universities of France, including the University of Paris, the most famous and oldest of all of the universities of Europe, fell at a stroke. Their privileges were abolished, their endowments were confiscated, and finally, by the law of September 1793, they were totally suppressed, together with the colleges and most surviving secondary schools. Never, not even at the Reformation or the Russian Revolution, was there such a wholesale slaughter of educational institutions. Of course, this wholesale slaughter of educational institutions that Dawson points out with horror was only one element of the complete reorganization of French society that included remaking the government, confiscation of all church property, the expelling of religious orders, the dissolution of religious vows, and the redefining of marriage. A key, a signal difference between the French Revolution and the American founding was that in 1776 there was no wholesale confiscation of property. I listen to Johnny Cash every morning when I'm getting ready, and I don't know, but as I was listening to Johnny Cash, this phrase just came to me and just kept pounding away in my brain: no wholesale confiscation of property. No wholesale confiscation of property, right? Where was that passage? Where was that passage in Dawson about the destruction of the endowment of all of the universities? Where was that? Private property, the property of the church, the endowment of schools and universities were left intact. The Episcopalian Church was not dissolved. The property of the Presbyterians, the liberty of the Baptists, and even the Roman Catholics was protected. Harvard, Princeton, William and Mary, each with their own religious affiliation, maintained their endowments untouched. The American founding was a political revolution without a social revolution. And the significant marker of that immense historical fact was that there was no absolute confiscation of property. Vive la différence! Right? This is where Russell Kirk grounds his treatment of what he terms the American order in his classic work, The Roots of the American Order. Kirk begins not with a theory or an examination of political theory, but with a historic fact of social continuity. Russell Kirk's two most influential books are The Conservative Mind, 1952, which can be said to have launched the conservative political movement and given it its name, a name that has become controversial now. Should we be conservatives? What is there left to conserve? And The Roots of the American Order, 1974, a historical narrative written in time for America's bicentennial, which sought to fundamentally overturn the progressive consensus about the spirit of '76. These two books are the bookends of Russell Kirk's career, which included a friendship with William F. Buckley, founding editor of National Review, and the founding of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. In both The Conservative Mind, at the beginning of his career, it was his doctoral dissertation at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and Roots of the American Order, which appeared just in time for the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s, that rode into office on a new alliance between fiscal and social conservatives. In both of these books, Russell Kirk can be said to take the Adams family view of the American founding over the Jeffersonian view. Not that Russell Kirk disdained Jefferson's contribution. He appreciated the early Jefferson of the Declaration of Independence, even while he espoused John Adams's resistance to the later Jefferson's enthusiasm for the French Revolution. Kirk wrote in The Conservative Mind about Jefferson, and I'm going to read you this little paragraph about Jefferson from The Conservative Mind. I don't know how many of you are Jeffersonians, how many of you love Jefferson, but this is Kirk on Jefferson, and I think it gives you a good sense of his prose style and a good sense of the tone of his thought. Right? He says, "Among the agrarian and egalitarian Republicans looms the angular figure of Jefferson, whose doctrines were always more radical than his practice and far less extreme than French notions of liberty. Jefferson tried his hand at everything and often succeeded, and as his talents were immensely varied, so did his character display odd and sometimes inconsistent facets. The sincere advocate of political purity and simplicity could recommend the infamous Gideon Granger, who bought and sold corruption in the gross for appointment to the Supreme Court of the United States. This exponent of strict construction of the Constitution could acquire Louisiana. Despite his love of variety and ingenuity, he could lay out the Northwest Territory on a checkerboard, sophisters, and calculators pattern that still makes the states that have been carved from that region dismally monotonous in their road patterns and arbitrary in their internal boundaries. Yet, for all this, and for all his acquaintance with the philosophes and his affection for France, Jefferson had Cook, Locke, and Keynes for his real political mentors, and like them, he had half a mind to be a conservative, and sometimes more than half a mind for it. Russell Kirk moves Jefferson in this paragraph, right, from being a radical in his doctrines, but his practice was always less radical than his doctrines. And his doctrines were never as radical as the French doctrines, and he had half a mind to be a conservative and sometimes more than half a mind to it. This is Kirk sort of moving even Jefferson, right, across the table. So Kirk can read even Jefferson as half conservative and more than half conservative. But in Roots of the American Order, Kirk does in fact launch from the later debate between not just John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, but the Adams family writ large and Thomas Jefferson. One has to say the Adams family writ large because a star role is given to John Adams's son, John Quincy Adams, later ambassador to Great Britain, Secretary of State, and president in his own right. Kirk's chapter on the American founding in The Roots of the American Order entitled Declaration and Constitution. Begins with a section called A Revolution Not Made But Prevented. In this section, Kirk introduces us to two slim little volumes by John Quincy Adams. Has anyone actually followed the order of the reading on the schedule instead of just starting the book at the beginning and plowing through? Yes? And so you've actually looked at this later section, Declaration and Constitution? Yes. And so you find there, I hope it comes to you as a little bit of a surprise, right? Hello, John Quincy Adams is going to be our guide to the interpretation of the American founding, right? This isn't your usual guide, right? So these two slim little volumes by John Quincy Adams, his 1791 Letters of Publicola, which he wrote when he was 23 years old. And Kirk says in his Letters of Publicola, he demolishes Thomas Paine's Age of Reason and the comparison that he makes between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And then his 1800 translation of Friedrich Gens's Origin and Principles of the American Revolution, compared with the origin and principles of the French Revolution. This is a kind of striking, daring move on Kirk's part. Who puts John Quincy Adams at the center of their interpretation of the American founding? But this is what Kirk does. He introduces us to John Quincy Adams, who introduces us to Friedrich Gentz. Friedrich Gentz was a German, a Prussian, who studied with Immanuel Kant. But after he read Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, he was converted to conservative principles, and he translated Burke's Reflections on the Revolution into German. And this was his first sally into political writing in Europe, and that is what first caught the attention of the political classes in Europe. Friedrich Gentz would go on to be an associate of Metternich and an architect of the reorganization of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. So John Quincy Adams picks up this little essay, I love it, self-publishing Friedrich Gentz, right? He publishes in he is the editor of a magazine and the sole writer for that magazine. Sounds like an online blogger, right? But John Quincy Adams, who is minister plenipotentiary to the court of Prussia at the time, reads this essay and writes to Gentz. He said, "It cannot but afford a gratification to every American attached to his country to see its revolution so ably vindicated from the imputation of having originated or having been conducted upon the same principles as that of France." And then in Letters of Publicola, John Quincy Adams writes, "Happy, thrice happy the people of America, whose gentleness of manners and habits of virtue are still sufficient to reconcile the enjoyment of their natural rights with the peace and tranquility of their country, whose principles of religious liberty did not result from an indiscriminate contempt of all religion whatever, and whose equal representation in their legislative councils was founded upon an equality really existing among them, and not upon the metaphysical speculations of fanciful politicians, vainly contending against the unalterable course of events and the established order of nature." So this is where Kirk takes his stand, right? Not that this is his own peculiar 20th century vision of the American founding, but that John Adams and John Quincy Adams, players at the time, took this view of the American Revolution as being fundamentally different, not just in practice, but also in principle, to the French Revolution. And so we have this extraordinary book by Kirk. Right? It's not so much a great book as a great idea for a book. Right? It's a book that had to be written. And if a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly, right? And writing this kind of a book, right, about the 5 heritage cities of American civilization, right, putting them together in a single volume, right, had to be done. And if it had to be done, if it was worth doing, as Chesterton says, then it was worth doing badly, right? No one could do justice to the heritage of Jerusalem in a 20-page chapter. No one could do justice to the heritage of Athens in a 20-page chapter. Okay, he gives himself 40 pages for Rome, right? And he gives himself 6 chapters for London, right? Still, no one could do justice, right, in this kind of a volume to the magnitude of his argument, right? So you have to bear with him, right? If you find that in the Athens chapter there's no mention of Homer or Herodotus, well, can't cover everything in 20 pages, so we understand, right? If Christian Rome doesn't include anything about Boethius or Benedict, well, can't do everything in a 20-page chapter, so you just keep moving, right? It's easy to get critical of the book, right? And not recognize what it does manage to do, right? What the immense task that it has assigned itself. Making the argument that the American founding drew from the deep past of European and Christian civilization. The references to God as creator, providence, and supreme judge. The powerful underlying notion of the laws of nature and of nature's God. The ruling sense of the sinful fallibility of man and the impossibility of eliminating factions from political life. The ideal of moderation that gave rise to a complicated system of checks and balances. The historic sense of liberty versus empire. The danger of civil war. The idea of rights grounded in human nature itself. The tradition of representative institutions, juries, common law, an independent judiciary, and bills of rights. These may all be revolutionary ideas, but they were not invented in the 18th century. They were not new in 1776. As Jefferson himself wrote, they were the ideas common to the American public, drawn from Aristotle and Cicero, Locke and Sidney. Indeed, American legalese was, in the 18th century, indeed, American legalese is still Latin. The right of habeas corpus, ex post facto laws, stare decisis. We've just had a great battle over stare decisis in the Dobbs decision, right? When a young Yankee came home from college, be it John Adams coming home from Harvard, or James Madison coming home from Princeton, or Alexander Hamilton from King's College, Columbia, or Thomas Jefferson from William and Mary, when a young American came home from college in the colonial period, he knew a little bit of Latin and less Greek. In fact, to get into Harvard, they didn't test your English on an SAT, right? All they did was have you translate Greek into Latin and Latin into Greek, right? That was the entrance exam for Harvard. His mind was a mixture of English and Latin, just as his clothing had become a mixture of colonial, provincial, and pretentious and foppish. A combination of cowboy boots and bow ties, shall we say? A mixture, right? Kind of like that delightful mixture which is the cure for the common cold. Pasta and cheese. Macaroni, right? I hope you all know that that is the cure for COVID. The true cure for COVID is mac and cheese. This mixture, this macaroni, right, became the mark of a British colonial's cultural heritage. A little bit of classical, a little bit of Christian, a little bit of English, a little bit of Latin, right? Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. You guys do know that song, don't you? Let me try that again. Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. Thank you. Yes, called it macaroni. I always thought that was a nonsense song. We learn a lot of nonsense songs when we're children, and I thought that was a nonsense song. But in fact, it's not a nonsense word. It refers to a style of dress, refers to a style of speech, and at a deeper level, it refers to a style of mind, a mind that is a mixture of the Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian tradition writ large. Russell Kirk's whole book is structured around the 5 heritage cities of the Christian West: Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, London, and Philadelphia. The table of contents doesn't make that absolutely clear. You have to go through your table of contents, right? And indicate which chapter is the Jerusalem chapter and the Athens chapter, and then Rome Christian and Rome classical, right? And then London and London and London and London, right? London medieval, London early modern, London Enlightenment, London, imperial. The thesis writ large is that the American founding was not a rupture with the past, but rather drew deeply from cultural roots embedded in the past. These are the heritage cities that we'll dip into over the course of this week. Just as it is impossible for Kirk to do justice to the influence of Athens in a 20-page chapter, it will be impossible for us to do justice to Athens in a day or in a lecture, whichever one of us lectures, gets to be Mr. Athens for the purposes of the ISI Honors Program week, right? Or Mr. Jerusalem. I think we actually have 5 people trying to do Jerusalem this week, which looks like we're going to do one thing thoroughly, right? At least we're going to try. Don't hold Russell Kirk accountable for what he didn't manage to include, right? Don't hold your speakers accountable for what they didn't manage to include, right? But just take this book and this week as an invitation to spend the rest of your life fleshing out your understanding of the immense cultural heritage that went into shaping American civilization. And I hope that at the end you will recognize that if you were to cut into an American, there's more to those bones and veins and tendons and muscles than just solid liberal non-substance. Thank you.